Hey guys! Tonight we begin with blood mud and the end of an empire. They worshipped gods with blood, built floating cities out of mud, ruled over millions across valleys and volcanoes, and yet it all crumbled in less than 2 years. In 1519, 400 Spaniards stepped onto foreign soil, starving, scarred and burning with ambition. What they found wasn't a tribe, it was an empire. The Aztecs. Brilliant astronomers, ruthless warriors, poets, builders, priests. They read the stars, engineered aqueducts, tracked the calendar to the hour. But they also feared prophecy, and they believed the gods were coming back. So when Hernan Cortés arrived in armor and arrogance, they thought he was divine. He wasn't. He was a gambler, a manipulator, a conqueror. And what followed was not a war, it was a collapse. Alliances shattered, smallpox spread, betrayals multiplied. And within 2 years, one of the most powerful empires in the Americas was gone. Tonight we'll walk through the final days of Tenochtitlan, its lakes, its temples, its doomed rulers. We'll meet the emperor who greeted a god and got a sword, and we'll see how 400 men didn't just win a war, they cracked an entire world open. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, and drift with me into a history soaked in gold, blood, and silence. And hey, if you like falling asleep to uncomfortable truths, go ahead and subscribe and tell me what time it is where you are right now. At the cusp of the year 1519, the land we now know as Mexico was dominated by a power unlike any the arriving Europeans had ever encountered. The Aztec Empire, or more accurately the Triple Alliance, stood as the undisputed master of Mesoamerica. While often referred to simply as the Aztec Empire, its true origins lay in a strategic pact forged in 1428. 3 powerful city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, united their forces, pooling their resources and military might to overthrow their former overlords, the city of Azcapotzalco. This alliance was born from necessity, a shared desire for independence and dominance. From this tripartite foundation, one city-state would quickly rise above the others, Tenochtitlan. Built on an island in the vast Lake Texcoco, this metropolis home to the Mexica people rapidly became the political, economic, and military heart of the alliance. Its strategic location, sophisticated infrastructure including extensive causeways and aqueducts, and its fierce warrior culture propelled it to preeminence. As Tenochtitlan's power grew, so too did its demands upon the city-states and peoples who fell under its sway. The Triple Alliance did not rule through direct administration in the European sense across its entire territory. Instead, it operated more as a hegemonic power, extracting tribute from conquered polities. And the price of falling under the yoke of Tenochtitlan was steep. These tributaries were compelled to supply the Triple Alliance not only with vast quantities of raw materials, foodstuffs like maize and beans, textiles like cotton, luxury goods like jade turquoise and the iridescent feathers of the Quetzal bird, but also with a grim, steady flow of human beings. Human sacrifice was a central, albeit complex and often misunderstood element of Aztec religion. The Mexica believed they owed a profound debt to the gods, particularly Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, and the sun, who required nourishment in the form of human hearts and blood to ensure the sun continued its journey across the sky and the world did not end. While the exact number of individuals sacrificed remains a subject of historical debate and is difficult to ascertain, precisely contemporary Spanish accounts and later indigenous codices suggest the scale could be immense. It is believed that in times of severe crisis, such as prolonged drought threatening the harvest, ritual killings could escalate dramatically, potentially numbering in the thousands over just a few days as a desperate plea to the deities. Aztec warfare was intrinsically linked to this religious practice. Beyond the conquest of territory and the collection of tribute, a significant goal of military campaigns was the capture of prisoners. Warriors embarked on what were known as flower wars Xochiayotl, with neighbouring unconquered city-states like Tlaxcala. These were often pre-arranged conflicts fought by elite warriors with the explicit aim of capturing combatants alive for later ritual sacrifice in Tenochtitlan. These wars served multiple purposes, training young warriors, demonstrating military might, preventing larger, more destructive wars, and crucially providing the necessary captives for the altars. Furthermore, some historical accounts, albeit debated and complex in interpretation, suggest that certain members of the Aztec aristocracy may have engaged in ritualistic cannibalism, consuming small portions of the bodies of some sacrifice victims as a way to commune with the divine, or absorb the victim's strength or essence. This practice was not widespread or casual dining, but a specific ritualistic act tied to sacrifice. However, it is crucial to understand that life in Tenochtitlan was far more multifaceted than this often cited darker side of Aztec culture suggests. The Mexica were not solely consumed by the gruesome offerings and peculiar appetites. They possessed a sophisticated and complex society that greatly valued scholarship, art, and intellectual pursuits. Tenochtitlan itself contained extensive libraries filled with manuscripts known as codices, covering a vast array of topics. These pictorial and glyphic books recorded history genealogies of rulers, religious beliefs and rituals, governmental organization, astronomical observations, agricultural practices, and detailed geographical knowledge of their empire and beyond. Education was highly valued with distinct schooling systems for commoners and nobles. The Mexica had a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, developing a complex calendar system that was remarkably accurate. Their agricultural techniques, particularly the use of chinampas, artificial islands built on the lake for intensive farming, were incredibly productive and innovative, supporting the massive population of their capital. This was the powerful, complex, and internally contradictory empire that stood at the pinnacle of its influence. A civilization with immense wealth, military, might intricate social structures, and a deeply ingrained religious system that permeated every aspect of life. But its very structure, reliant on tribute and projecting an often brutal authority, had sowed seeds of resentment among its subject peoples, creating vulnerabilities that would soon be exploited by an unforeseen force. For over a quarter century after Christopher Columbus's initial voyage, Spanish presence in the New World had been consolidating its hold on the islands of the Caribbean. Cuba, under the governorship of Diego Velázquez, had become a key staging point for further exploration and conquest. Rumours of rich, powerful civilizations on the mainland cities, rumoured to be overflowing with gold, had filtered back to the Spanish colonies. These tales fueled the insatiable European appetite for wealth status and the expansion of Christendom. 2 prior Spanish expeditions had already tentatively probed the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, making brief contact and gathering tantalizing hints of the riches that lay inland. But it was the 3rd expedition, launched in February 1519, that would irrevocably alter the course of Mesoamerican history. Its leader was a complex, ambitious, and utterly determined man named Hernán Cortés. Cortés was not simply following orders. He was following in the wake of these previous explorations, driven by an exceptional level of ambition. A hidalgo from a relatively poor noble family in western Spain, Cortés had arrived in the New World seeking fortune and glory. He proved adept at navigating the complex politics of the Spanish colonies, securing land and labour in Cuba. However, his relationship with Governor Velázquez was fraught with tension, a mixture of professional rivalry and personal animosity. Velázquez, having invested in the expedition, grew suspicious of Cortés's burgeoning influence and independent spirit. At the 11th hour, perhaps sensing Cortés was about to become too powerful and potentially claim the glory and riches for himself, Velázquez revoked Cortés's commission to lead the expedition. For a lesser man, this would have been the end of the road, facing certain political ruin, potential imprisonment, or worse, for defying a direct order from the king's representative. But Cortés was not a lesser man. In a bold, calculated act of mutiny, Cortés chose to ignore the governor's order. He rallied his approximately 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and a small number of cannons and arquebuses, and set sail from Cuba for the mainland. This was an act of supreme defiance, an all-or-nothing gamble. Cortés understood the immense risk. His very life and fortune depended entirely on the success of this unauthorized venture. He needed a significant, undeniable triumph to justify his insubordination to the Spanish crown. As fate would have it, the necessary, albeit unexpected, assistance Cortés needed to achieve his ambitious goals would soon present itself. On their voyage towards their initial planned landing spot on the Yucatan Peninsula, Cortés's fleet encountered a stroke of remarkable fortune. They came across a shipwrecked Spaniard, one of the few survivors of a previous ill-fated expedition, who'd been living among the local Mayan people for several years. His name was Jerónimo de Aguilar. Aguilar had learned to speak the local Mayan language fluently during his time living with the indigenous population. Recognizing his invaluable potential, Cortés promptly brought him aboard. Aguilar immediately became a crucial asset, serving as the expedition's primary translator between Spanish and Mayan. A few weeks later, Aguilar's usefulness was further underscored during peace negotiations with the leaders of Potonchan, a Mayan city-state the Spanish had encountered near the mouth of the Grijalva River. Following some initial skirmishes, the Maya sought to appease the newcomers. As a gesture of peace and submission, they offered Cortés gifts including food, gold, ornaments, and 20 enslaved women. Among these women was one who would prove to be perhaps the most important individual in the entire conquest narrative, a young woman of remarkable intelligence and linguistic ability. This woman, whose indigenous name may have been Malinali, and whom the Spanish would call Marina and later famously La Malinche, possessed a rare and vital skill. She spoke not only the local Mayan language, but also Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire. With Aguilar translating Spanish into Mayan, and this young woman translating Mayan into Nahuatl, Cortés now possessed an unprecedented linguistic bridge to the vast and mysterious Aztec world that lay ahead. Together, Aguilar and La Malinche formed a crucial, indispensable link, allowing Cortés to communicate, negotiate, gather intelligence, and ultimately divide and conquer. Armed with the power of language as well as the technological advantages of steel weaponry, gunpowder and horses, the Spaniards were now equipped to confront the great Aztec Empire. Their ultimate destination, the legendary city of Tenochtitlan. Upon reaching the central Gulf Coast, Cortés made his next strategic move. He declared the establishment of a new settlement, La Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, the rich town of the True Cross. This act, however, was less about founding a permanent settlement and more about political maneuvering. By establishing a town and appointing municipal officials loyal to him, Cortés was effectively creating a legal entity under Spanish law that answered directly to the crown, circumventing the authority of Governor Velázquez in Cuba. Veracruz at this point was little more than a name on a map and a rudimentary beachhead, but it provided Cortés with a crucial legal pretext for his actions. He could now claim to be acting not as a mutinous adventurer under Velázquez's command, but as an official representative of a new Spanish town accountable only to the king himself. It was a brilliant, audacious legal sleight of hand that further solidified his defiance and committed his men to his cause. There was no turning back. Cortés's arrival on the Gulf Coast and his establishing a foothold had not gone unnoticed. The vast network of intelligence and tribute flowing into Tenochtitlan quickly brought news of the strange newcomers and their floating houses to the attention of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II. Moctezuma IX Tlatoani or ruler of Tenochtitlan, was a complex figure known for his piety, intelligence, and scholarly pursuits, but perhaps less so for decisive military action in the face of the unknown. Moctezuma chose a cautious diplomatic approach. Rather than immediately sending a military force, he dispatched representatives to the Spanish camp. These were not warriors, but high-ranking noblemen bearing lavish gifts. Exquisite gold ornaments, intricately crafted featherwork, fine cotton textiles. They welcomed Cortés and his party with formal courtesy, expressing interest in their presence. Moctezuma's intentions with these gifts were likely multifaceted. He wished to display his power and wealth, gauge the strength and intentions of these strangers, and perhaps most importantly subtly dissuade them from proceeding inland and towards his capital. The gifts were a demonstration of what they could receive if they stayed put and acted as trading partners or tributaries, hinting at dangers and difficulties that awaited them further inland. He may also have been trying to keep the Spanish in one place where his spies could monitor their movements and numbers. However, Moctezuma's strategy backfired spectacularly. Far from being intimidated or satisfied, the sight of such incredible wealth only further inflamed the Spaniards' greed. The gold confirmed every rumour, every wild tale they had heard. It was tangible proof of the riches waiting in the interior. Cortés, seeing the gold, felt not dissuaded, but emboldened. He recognized the immense potential prize and understood that diplomacy alone would not yield the conquest he craved. Meanwhile, Cortés's presence had not only alerted the Aztecs, but also provided an opportunity for the numerous indigenous groups who resented Aztec dominance. Years of often brutal Aztec rule, the heavy burden of tribute, and the constant threat of having their people taken for sacrifice had left deep-seated animosity among many of the tributary states. One such group was the Totonac Confederacy, who controlled the region around Veracruz. The Totonacs, burdened by Aztec demands, saw the Spanish as potential liberators or at least powerful allies against their hated overlords. Cortés, with his keen political instincts, recognized this immediately. He actively cultivated alliances with these disaffected groups, promising protection and an end to Aztec tribute in exchange for their loyalty and support. The Totonacs relatively easily persuaded by this offer, and the perceived power of the Spanish were among the first to formally ally with Cortés against the Triple Alliance. This was a critical turning point. The Spanish conquest would not be a purely European affair, but a complex coalition built on existing indigenous grievances. News of the Spanish Totonac alliance quickly reached Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma, sensing the situation was escalating beyond simple diplomacy, sent forth yet another delegation. These ambassadors were again polite, bearing more gifts of gold and cloth, reiterating the warnings about the dangers of the journey inland and the difficulties that the Spanish would face. They continued to try and dissuade Cortés from visiting Tenochtitlan, perhaps hoping to contain the threat or delay its arrival. But Cortés's mind was made up. The sight of the wealth had only solidified his resolve. He saw the diplomatic efforts not as a deterrent, but as confirmation of the prize's value and the Emperor's apprehension. It was time to move inland, to march directly towards the source of the gold and power. This was his moment, his gamble. To ensure the absolute commitment of his own men, some of whom were still loyal to Velázquez or harboured doubts about the perilous journey ahead, Cortés took a drastic, decisive action. He ordered his ships scuttled, deliberately destroyed or rendered unusable. This wasn't burning the ships, a romanticized myth, but a systematic disabling. Sails were removed, rigging taken down, hulls bored through, making it impossible for the ships to sail back to Cuba and report his actions, or for any faint-hearted soldier to abandon the expedition. With their only means of retreat gone, Cortés's men were now fully committed. It was all or nothing. Success meant unimaginable riches and glory. Failure meant likely death at the hands of hostile natives or execution for mutiny if they ever made it back to Spanish territory. The path to Tenochtitlan was laid bare, a path of no return. Leaving a small garrison at Veracruz, Cortés and his coalition of Spaniards and Totonac allies began their audacious march towards the heart of the Aztec Empire. The journey would be long, arduous, and filled with unforeseen challenges, leading them deeper into a land that was both breathtakingly beautiful and terrifyingly unknown. The march inland from the coast brought Cortés and his allies through diverse landscapes from the humid lowlands to the cooler highlands. They traversed territories controlled by various indigenous groups, some friendly, some neutral, and some fiercely independent and hostile to anyone associated with the Aztecs, including those who seemed to be marching towards the Aztec capital. It was upon entering the territory of the Tlaxcalan Confederacy that the true test of Cortés's alliance-building strategy and the mettle of his men would begin. The Tlaxcalans were a powerful independent group who had steadfastly resisted Aztec attempts at conquest for nearly a century. They were the Triple Alliance's bitterest enemies, locked in a perpetual state of flower wars that had cost both sides dearly and fostered deep-seated animosity. Seeing a large foreign force seemingly allied with Aztec tributaries, the Totonacs marching through their land, the Tlaxcalans viewed them as a threat, potentially even a vanguard for yet another Aztec invasion. Violence erupted quickly. What followed was a brutal, protracted conflict lasting for nearly 3 weeks in September 1519. The Tlaxcalans, numbering in the tens of thousands, launched relentless attacks on the Spanish column. Cortés's men, despite their superior weaponry, steel swords and armor firearms like arquebuses and cannons, and the terrifying effectiveness of cavalry charges against infantry unfamiliar with horses, were constantly harried. The fighting was fierce and bloody. The Spanish faced overwhelming numbers and determined resistance. Tlaxcalan tactics, while initially surprised by Spanish technology, adapted quickly. They attempted to trap cavalry attack at night and overwhelm the Spanish with sheer force. The cost was high for both sides. After 18 grueling days of warfare, Cortés's force had suffered significantly, losing approximately half of their precious cavalry and a fifth of their Spanish infantry. Their indigenous allies also suffered heavy casualties. Despite the brutal fighting, Cortés saw an opportunity. Through La Malinche, he conveyed to the Tlaxcalan leaders that his true enemy was not them but the Aztecs, the very people who had been their relentless adversaries for generations. He presented the possibility of a shared enemy, a common goal in overthrowing the Aztec Empire. The Tlaxcalans had every reason to despise the Aztecs. Their territory had been significantly reduced by Aztec conquest during the Flower Wars. They had suffered countless losses, and their independence was a constant costly struggle. Seeing the Spanish ability to withstand their attacks, their seemingly unstoppable technology, and hearing Cortés's offer of alliance against their ancient foe, the Tlaxcalan leaders made a momentous decision. They laid down their arms and agreed to ally with Cortés. This alliance was not born of trust or affection, but of mutual strategic interest and a shared hatred of the Aztecs. It was a turning point in the conquest. Cortés had gained not just safe passage, but tens of thousands of experienced, fierce indigenous warriors who knew the land, knew the Aztec military, and were eager for retribution. The Tlaxcalan alliance would prove indispensable to Cortés's success, providing the sheer numbers and local knowledge that the small Spanish force desperately needed. However, the violence did not cease simply because a new alliance was forged. Before proceeding directly to Tenochtitlan, Cortés and his newly reinforced army marched alongside their Tlaxcalan allies towards the city of Cholula. Cholula was a major religious center renowned for its massive pyramid and countless temples dedicated to various deities. It had a complex history formerly within the Tlaxcalan sphere of influence before shifting its allegiance and allying with the Aztecs. The exact reasons for the horrific events that transpired in Cholula are still debated by historians with conflicting accounts from Spanish and indigenous sources. Spanish accounts often claim they acted preemptively upon discovering a plot by the Cholulans and Aztecs to ambush and destroy their force, perhaps instigated by the Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcalan accounts emphasize Cholula's shift in allegiance and their long-standing rivalry. Regardless of the precise trigger, over the course of several days, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies massacred a significant portion of the civilian population of Cholula. This act of extreme brutality served multiple purposes. For the Tlaxcalans, it was likely an act of revenge against a former ally who had switched sides in a rival religious center. For the Spanish, it was a chilling demonstration of their power and ruthlessness. While it was clear that many city-states harbored grievances against the Aztecs at Cholula, Cortés clearly demonstrated what would happen to cities that did not align with him or were perceived as threats. It sent a brutal message across Mesoamerica, forcing other potential allies or adversaries to carefully consider their options. Their ranks now swollen by thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors and having left a trail of devastation and fear, the Spanish-led coalition continued its advance towards the Valley of Mexico. The ultimate prize, the gleaming city of Tenochtitlan, lay just days away. By the first week of November 1519, the surviving conquistadors and their indigenous allies finally reached the edge of the Valley of Mexico. Spread before them was a sight that astonished even the most seasoned veterans: the vast, magnificent city of Tenochtitlan. Home to an estimated 300,000 inhabitants, this metropolis was unlike anything they'd ever seen. It dwarfed almost all contemporary European cities in terms of population and scale. London at the time likely had fewer than 50,000 residents, Paris around 200,000, while major cities in Spain like Seville or Cordoba were significantly smaller. The vista of its many canals teeming with canoes, its densely populated neighborhoods imposing temples and palaces, and the colossal Templo Mayor at its center, built on an island in the middle of a lake connected to the mainland by massive stone causeways, struck the approaching Spaniards with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was present later, wrote of their wonder, questioning whether they were seeing a dream or reality, having never witnessed such a sight before. Moctezuma, having failed in his attempts to dissuade Cortés from visiting the city, now felt obliged to welcome these strange, powerful visitors into his capital. He met Cortés on the great causeway leading into Tenochtitlan, a formal and elaborate ceremony attended by Aztec noblemen. Gifts were exchanged, speeches delivered through the chain of translators. Cortés spoke to Aguilar in Spanish, who translated to La Malinche in Mayan, who translated to Moctezuma in Nahuatl, and vice versa. Moctezuma extended his hospitality, housing Cortés and his principal men within one of his own opulent palaces, the former palace of his father Axayacatl, located near the ceremonial center of the city. While seemingly a gesture of welcome, it was also a strategic move, allowing Moctezuma to keep the Spanish confined and under close observation. It was within the confines of this palace, perhaps while searching for suitable lodgings or simply exploring, that the conquistadors made a discovery that both confirmed their wildest dreams and sealed the fate of their hosts. They stumbled upon a secret room where the emperor kept a significant portion of his treasure. The sight of numerous golden objects, intricate jewelry, ceremonial masks, plates, ingots, precious stones like jade and turquoise, dumbfounded the Spaniards. This was the fabled gold they had risked everything for, a hoard of wealth beyond their imagining. Having located the rumoured treasure trove, Cortés's position within the city shifted from guest to something more imposing. His apprehension lessened, replaced by a growing sense of power and entitlement. Cortés, never one to miss an opportunity, began to exert pressure on Moctezuma. His demands were not initially military, but religious and symbolic. He asked Moctezuma to allow his men to erect a Christian cross and an image of the Virgin Mary within the sacred precinct right next to the massive idols of the principal Aztec deities Huitzilopochtli and Tezcatlipoca atop the Templo Mayor. This provocative request was met with understandable horror and consternation among the Mexica, particularly the priests and noblemen. Placing foreign rival religious symbols in the most sacred spot of their city was an unthinkable sacrilege, a direct challenge to their gods and their entire cosmic order. Despite Moctezuma's attempts to maintain peace, this demand, combined with the underlying tension of the Spanish presence, proved to be the spark that ignited the volatile situation. Violence erupted, likely initiated by outraged Aztec citizens or priests. This sudden explosion of hostility cost the lives of 7 Spaniards, a significant loss for their small contingent and a stark reminder of their precarious position within the vast and potentially hostile city. Realizing the extreme danger they were now in, outnumbered and isolated Cortés retaliated with characteristic boldness and ruthlessness. He ordered the immediate seizure of Emperor Moctezuma. Spanish soldiers stormed the section of the palace where Moctezuma resided and placed him under house arrest. With the emperor essentially held hostage within his own palace, Cortés assumed an extraordinary degree of control over the city's affairs, ruling indirectly through his captive. The Spaniards hoped that by holding Moctezuma they could effectively paralyze the Aztec leadership and dissuade the population from further resistance. Moctezuma, for his part, continued to adhere to his policy of diplomacy and appeasement, perhaps believing the Spanish could eventually be placated and persuaded to leave, or perhaps paralyzed by indecision and superstition. He firmly refused advice from his chieftains and advisors, who urged him to order an immediate attack to expel the Spanish. Instead, he seemingly yielded to Cortés's demands, even allowing the construction of a Catholic altar within the sacred precinct of the Templo Mayor. This act, allowing the Spanish to desecrate the most holy site in Tenochtitlan, was seen by many Mexica as a profound betrayal and a devastating sign of their emperor's weakness and submission. It was the first undeniable evidence that the once mighty ruler of the great Aztec Empire had been reduced in the eyes of many of his people, and indeed in the eyes of history, to little more than a puppet of Hernán Cortés. The uneasy truce in Tenochtitlan was fraying, held together only by the captive emperor and the Spaniards' tenuous control. But forces far beyond the city walls were already in motion, destined to shatter this fragile peace. The story of the Spanish conquest is one of relentless ambition, where every moment counted and every decision was critical. Just as historical figures relied on tools and alliances, modern life demands precision and connection. Speaking of precision, the history of the wristwatch is fascinating. Once a novelty adorning the wrists of the wealthy and royalty, modern conflicts, like the First World War, rapidly transformed them into vital instruments of war, with soldiers relying on them to synchronize critical operations. This shifted the wristwatch's status from ornamental to indispensable. Today, wristwatches don't just help manage time, they also serve as a reminder to take time for ourselves whenever needed. Hoska, the sponsor of today's video, continues this legacy by merging timeless elegance with modern ingenuity and natural materials. Their high-quality watches, jewellery and accessories are the perfect gift for any occasion or style. I've had my Hoska watch for several months now and I wear it regularly during my on-screen scenes. I also really enjoy these amazing handcrafted sunglasses that I just received. The quality is exceptional and you can feel the care that goes into each piece. All Hoska pieces are guaranteed for 24 months, giving you peace of mind with your purchase. And ordering online is incredibly easy, with free duty and import tax-free shipping to the US and most EU countries arriving typically within just 2 to 5 days. You can support our channel directly and get something beautiful for yourself or a loved one. Followers who use our special discount code ARMCHAIR15 at checkout will receive 15% off of all products. Support our channel by clicking the link in the description below and choose your own personal piece of nature for everyday life with Hosca. While Cortés navigated the treacherous political landscape within Tenochtitlan, holding the emperor captive and attempting to assert control, a significant development was unfolding approximately 250 miles to the east back on the Gulf Coast. Governor Diego Velázquez in Cuba had not forgotten Cortés's blatant act of mutiny. Infuriated by Cortés's defiance and determined to assert his authority and claim the riches of the mainland for himself, Velázquez dispatched a large expedition with explicit orders: arrest Cortés and take command of his enterprise. This punitive force consisted of around 900 conquistadors, significantly outnumbering Cortés's force, along with horses, artillery and supplies. It was led by Pánfilo de Narváez, a veteran commander loyal to Velázquez. Their objective was clear: put an end to Cortés's unauthorized conquest and bring him to justice. News of Narváez's landing reached Cortés in Tenochtitlan. He understood the dire threat this posed. Not only did he face the constant potential for an Aztec uprising, but now he had a far larger Spanish force backed by the governor's authority coming to arrest him. Cortés, ever the gambler, made another daring decision. He couldn't fight two wars at once. He had to neutralize Narváez. Assembling his most trusted men, approximately 250 soldiers, Cortés prepared to march back to the coast to confront Narváez. This left him with a critical decision regarding Tenochtitlan. He chose to leave a small garrison of around 160 Spaniards in charge of the city, and more importantly in custody of Moctezuma. The commander he entrusted with this perilous task was Pedro de Alvarado. This would prove to be a fateful decision. Pedro de Alvarado, known for his striking appearance and battlefield bravery, was also notoriously cruel, easily angered, and possessed little patience or respect for the Aztec people, their customs, or their religious practices. His understanding of the delicate balance Cortés had maintained with Moctezuma was minimal. In May 1520, with Cortés away, Moctezuma requested permission from Alvarado to hold the annual festival of Toxcatl, a major religious celebration honouring the god Tezcatlipoca. The festival involved feasting, dancing, and critically human sacrifice. Alvarado granted permission, but his suspicions and fear of the Aztecs, coupled with potentially seeing the gold jewellery worn by the participants, led to a horrific act of violence. On May 22nd, while the mostly unarmed Aztec noblemen and warriors were performing ceremonial dances within the courtyard of the Great Temple Alvarado, and his men sealed the exits and unleashed a sudden brutal attack, they massacred nearly all of those gathered, slaughtering the Aztec aristocracy in cold blood. Alvarado's men later claimed they acted preemptively to prevent the human sacrifices or to thwart a rumoured uprising. Aztec survivors and accounts vehemently disputed this, asserting that the Spaniards were motivated by greed, driven into a frenzy by the sight of the gold jewellery worn by the festive participants. Whatever the immediate trigger, the massacre was an unprovoked act of stunning barbarity that shattered any semblance of peace and ignited the simmering resentment into open revolt. Hearing of the massacre, the Aztec population pushed past their breaking point, rose up in a furious revolt. They surrounded the palace where the Spanish garrison and Moctezuma were quartered, laying siege to the beleaguered force. Meanwhile, back east, Cortés was executing his plan to confront Narváez. Moving with speed and stealth, Cortés managed to surprise Narváez's forces at Cempoala, a Totonac town. Under the cover of nightfall, Cortés launched a daring attack. His smaller but highly motivated and experienced force of approximately 250 Spaniards, augmented by around 200 native allies, assaulted Narváez's numerically superior camp of 900. Cortés's surprise attack was remarkably successful. Despite Narváez having horsemen and artillery, Cortés's men, fighting fiercely and utilizing the element of surprise, soundly defeated the larger force. Narváez himself was wounded and captured, in a move that was the ultimate slap in the face to Governor Velázquez Cortés. then convince the defeated soldiers of Narvaez's expedition to join his ranks. He did this primarily by playing to their shared desires, promising them a share in the boundless riches of the Aztec Empire. Riches they now knew were real, unlike the comparatively meager rewards they had found elsewhere. Overnight, Cortez's small unauthorized force swelled with hundreds of new well-equipped men. Reinforced and victorious Cortez received urgent messages from Tenochtitlan describing the dire situation there. He immediately turned his now considerably larger army around and began the hurried march back towards the Aztec capital. Upon his arrival, he found Alvarado's men under desperate siege in Moctezuma's palace, surrounded by a hostile city in full revolt. Acting quickly to try and regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation, Cortez ordered Moctezuma to address his people. He hoped that the emperor, despite being a captive, could still command enough authority to quell the rebellion, allow the Spanish to withdraw peacefully, and perhaps even restore the fragile peace. In a final tragic and utterly doomed attempt to restore order, Moctezuma appeared before his people on a rooftop attempting to speak to them. However, this desperate gesture was met not with obedience but with a storm of fury. The crowd no longer saw their emperor as their leader, but as a puppet of the invaders. Cheers of defiance and anger rose from the assembled Aztecs as Moctezuma faced a rain of stones and darts hurled by his own subjects. The people had had enough of their emperor's perceived inaction and submission. They had in fact already chosen his successor, his brother Cuitlahuac, a fierce advocate for resistance. The tragic Moctezuma, struck by projectiles from his own people, would not survive the assault. While some Spanish accounts claim he died from these injuries a few days later, Aztec accounts would later controversially claim that he was killed by the Spaniards after his usefulness to them had expired, and they were preparing their escape. The precise circumstances of his death remain debated, but his passing marked the definitive end of his rule and any hope for a peaceful resolution. With Moctezuma dead and the city in open revolt under a new determined leader, Cuitlahuac Cortez found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. His men were trapped in the palace, surrounded by an enraged Aztec population. Supplies were rapidly dwindling and the constant attacks were taking their toll. Their primary bargaining chip, the emperor, was gone. Cortez realized time was running out. A breakout was their only option. Cortez decided they would attempt to escape under the cover of darkness. On the night of June 30th, 1520, a night made even darker and quieter by a welcome rainstorm, the Spanish and their remaining Tlaxcalan allies prepared to flee the city. Their plan was to move along the shortest causeway leading west out of Tenochtitlan towards the town of Tacuba on the mainland. They constructed a portable bridge, a causeway segment, to help them cross gaps in the causeway or potential breaches. Cortez ordered his men to take as much gold and other treasure as they could carry, a fatal instruction for many. Winding their way quietly through the sleeping city and onto the causeway, the column moved slowly, burdened by armor, weapons, and the heavy weight of stolen gold. For a brief time it seemed their desperate gamble might succeed. But their movement was soon detected. The alarm was sounded. Some accounts say it was an Aztec woman drawing water, others that Spanish carelessness alerted a sentry. Regardless, within moments the sleeping city erupted into action. Aztec warriors poured out from houses along the causeway, swarming the fleeing column. Hundreds of men in canoes armed with spears and darts emerged from the lake waters on either side, harassing Cortez's men as they fought their desperate way across the causeway. The causeway became a death trap. Spanish soldiers, weighed down by their heavy equipment and the sacks of gold they refused to abandon, struggled to fight and move. When the column hit gaps in the causeway or faced intense attacks, some lost their footing or were pushed into the lake. Their heavy loads, the very treasure they desired, became lead weights, pulling them down into the muddy depths. Horses struggled and fell, artillery precious and irreplaceable sank. In the chaos, Cortés himself, along with a vanguard of horsemen and his most loyal men, pushed ahead, managing to fight their way off the causeway and reach the relative safety of the mainland near the village of Tacuba. It was here, according to the account of Conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, that Cortés, safe himself, witnessed the horrific slaughter unfolding on the causeway behind him. Looking back at the carnage, the loss of so many men, and the near destruction of his force, the Spanish leader allegedly broke down in tears. This bloody breakout attempt became known in Spanish and Mexican history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The losses were catastrophic. An estimated 400 to 800 Spaniards were killed, drowned or captured. The Tlaxcalans, who fought bravely alongside the Spanish, suffered even heavier casualties, with around 1,000 estimated killed. In terms of equipment, all of the cannons and most of the horses had been lost, along with the bulk of the treasure they had tried to carry. The exhausted and mostly wounded survivors were left with little more than the clothes on their backs, a few swords, and their dwindling numbers. Despite the scale of the disaster, the core of Cortés's leadership and the determination of the survivors remained. The Aztecs pursued the retreating force, attempting to deliver the killing blow and annihilate the Spanish entirely. About a week later, the two forces clashed again near Otumba. The Aztecs, perhaps made overconfident by their decisive victory on the Night of Sorrows, attacked the battered Spanish force. However, Cortés and his remaining men fought with desperate ferocity. The Spanish, skillfully utilizing their remaining cavalry to target Aztec leaders and fighting in tight formations, managed to hold their ground and eventually send the numerically superior Aztec army into disarray. It was a hard-won defensive victory that saved Cortés's expedition from complete destruction. Having fought off his pursuers, Cortés withdrew his remaining men to the relative safety of Tlaxcala, the territory of his loyal indigenous allies. Here they could rest, treat their wounded, and begin the monumental task of reorganizing and planning their next move. Though defeated on the field of battle and expelled from the capital, the Spanish were far from broken. The Aztecs, meanwhile, had retaken control over Tenochtitlan, celebrating their victory and the expulsion of the invaders. But this victory would prove tragically short-lived, as an unseen, insidious enemy was already making its way through the population. The Aztecs had won a great victory, expelling the Spanish from their capital. Cuitlahuac, the new emperor, ascended to power, immediately facing the daunting task of rebuilding and preparing for the inevitable Spanish return. His reign, however, was tragically cut short. Soon after the Spanish retreat, a far more lethal and insidious enemy arrived in Tenochtitlan: smallpox. The disease had been carried across the Atlantic by European passengers on Narvaez's ships and began spreading rapidly among the indigenous populations of the mainland. Having no prior exposure to smallpox, the people of Mesoamerica possessed no immunity to the virus. The consequences were catastrophic. The vulnerable Aztecs were particularly hard hit, trapped in their dense urban environment where the disease spread like wildfire. Thousands perished in short succession. The social and political structure of the empire was severely weakened as leaders, warriors, and ordinary citizens succumbed to the epidemic. Among the victims was the new emperor himself, Cuitlahuac, who died after a reign of only about 80 days. By the end of the year 1520, it is estimated that the smallpox epidemic had killed some 8 million people across the area, now known as Mexico, decimating populations and causing immense social disruption. This biological weapon, unintended by the Spanish, proved to be their most powerful ally. While smallpox ravaged Tenochtitlan, Cortés and his men were licking their wounds in Tlaxcala. Despite the heavy losses of the Night of Sorrows and the Battle of Otumba, their Tlaxcalan allies remained loyal and provided crucial support, offering food, shelter, and warriors. Furthermore, the alliance expanded. Cortés gained more native allies from other city-states like Texcoco, who also resented Aztec rule and saw an opportunity in the weakened state of the empire. Having recuperated and reinforced their ranks with thousands of indigenous warriors, Cortés began planning his return to Tenochtitlan. He understood that conquering the island city would require control of the lake. He ordered the construction of a fleet of small maneuverable warships called brigantines. These ships, built piece by piece in Tlaxcala and then disassembled and carried over the mountains by thousands of native porters to Lake Texcoco, were armed with cannons and would prove essential in a siege. In early 1521, well aware of the Aztec Empire's weakened state due to disease and the loss of key leaders, Cortés's revitalized army, now numbering perhaps 1,000 Spaniards and tens of thousands of indigenous allies, set off once again for Tenochtitlan. They undoubtedly expected a swift victory against a population decimated by smallpox and political turmoil. However, to their surprise, the defenders of Tenochtitlan, now led by the young and determined Emperor Cuauhtémoc Moctezuma's nephew, refused to yield. Despite the ravages of disease and the overwhelming odds, the Mexica fought with incredible courage and tenacity to defend their capital. The siege became a brutal war of attrition. Cortés ordered his forces to cut off the city's supply of fresh water from the mainland aqueduct on May the 10th, hoping to starve the city into submission. Yet even by the end of June, the defenders still stood firm, enduring thirst, starvation, and constant assault. Various attempts to end the siege through diplomacy and negotiation failed. Cuauhtémoc and his people refused to surrender. Frustrated by the prolonged resistance, Cortés ordered a massive assault aimed at seizing the Tlatelolco market square, the heart of the city. Their fighting was ferocious, street by street, house by house. The Spanish were forced to retreat in the face of heavy resistance. During the intense combat, Cortés himself was briefly captured by Aztec warriors and narrowly escaped with his life when his men fought desperately to rescue him. Brutal urban combat persisted week after week. The Spanish and their allies slowly advanced, systematically destroying buildings to prevent the Aztecs from using them as cover and making the terrain more suitable for their cavalry. The Mexica defenders, pushed back into smaller and smaller sections of the city, continued their fanatical resistance until the bitter end. The remaining defenders made their last stand in the Plaza Mayor, the main ceremonial square. Starving, exhausted, and with their city in ruins around them, they finally surrendered on August 13th, 1521, after a siege lasting 93 days. The reign of Cuauhtémoc, the 11th and last Aztec emperor, ended when he was captured trying to flee the city in a canoe. But the catastrophe that had befallen Tenochtitlan did not end with the surrender. The victorious Spaniards and their native allies, particularly the Tlaxcalans, who had suffered so much under Aztec rule, mercilessly sacked the city. They searched for gold and other valuables and enacted terrible revenge upon the defeated Mexica population. The once magnificent city was left in ruins. Hernán Cortés, whose audacious mutinous gamble had paid off so spectacularly, was rewarded for the astounding success of his conquest by the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, Charles III. In October 1522, he was officially named Captain General of the newly established Viceroyalty of New Spain, becoming the ruler of the vast territories he had conquered. Within just 2 short years, a defiant captain had become the most celebrated hero of Spain. Hernán Cortés's relatively small group of conquistadors, bolstered by crucial indigenous alliances, disease, and internal Aztec factors, had managed to vanquish an empire. The scale of the Aztec conquest, alongside the immense treasure it yielded, would not be matched until Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Incan Empire in modern-day Peru a decade later in the 1530s. However, as we've seen, Cortés's conquest was far from a straightforward military affair driven solely by Spanish strength. Besides the Spaniards' technological and tactical superiority in areas like steel gunpowder and horses, it was the vital support of large numbers of native allies eager to overthrow their Aztec oppressors that provided Cortés with the manpower he desperately needed. The overcaution and indecisiveness of Moctezuma in the early stages, combined with the devastating and brutal effects of the smallpox epidemic, all played crucial interconnected parts in the rapid toppling of the Aztec Empire. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the decisive start of further Spanish conquests in the region, ultimately leading to Spanish control over the entirety of Mesoamerica. This conquest, driven by the pursuit of wealth, glory, and religious fervour, was swiftly followed by the mass conversion of the indigenous people to Catholicism, sometimes by force, sometimes through complex processes of syncretism. Before long, intermarriage between ethnic Spaniards and native populations became common occurrences, creating a new mestizo population. This mixing of cultures, peoples, and traditions born from the crucible of conquest marked the beginning of the modern Mexican nation, a nation with a complex and often painful history shaped by the events that unfolded in 1519. The story of the Aztec conquest is a powerful reminder of the unpredictable forces that shape history. The clash of vastly different worlds and the enduring impact of ambition, alliance, disease, and the indomitable yet ultimately vulnerable human spirit. You think you know the Aztecs. Maybe you picture towering pyramids, dramatic sacrifices, or perhaps the moment Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, bringing their world crashing down. That final tragic encounter is often where the story begins for most of us. But what if I told you that narrow snapshot misses the real epic? What if everything you know about the Aztecs is based on the end, not the beginning? The truth is, the story of the Aztecs, or more accurately the Mexica, is one of the most incredible rags-to-riches tales in human history. It's a story of a small, desperate tribe wandering through a wilderness facing starvation, warfare, and betrayal, guided by a fierce god and ultimately forging one of the most powerful empires the Americas had ever seen. They weren't always the masters of Mesoamerica. They were outsiders, latecomers, forced to settle on unwanted land vassals to hostile neighbours. Their rise wasn't a sudden burst of glory. It was a grueling, centuries-long struggle against impossible odds. To truly understand the Aztecs, you have to go back long before the Spanish ever dreamed of a new world. You have to journey with them from a mythical homeland through trials and tribulations to the moment they spotted an eagle on a cactus, a sign that would change everything. This is the real story of the rise of the Aztec Empire. And it's a story far more complex, far more human, and far more astonishing than you've ever heard. Join us as we unravel the misunderstood moments and finally provide proper context for the incredible journey of the Mexica people from wandering nomads to the rulers of a vast empire. Our journey begins not in the grand plazas of Tenochtitlan, but in the mists of time and legend. The Spanish chroniclers of the 16th century, captivated by the empire they encountered, recorded the Aztec origin story as told to them by the native people. They spoke of a mythical homeland far to the north, a great island called Aztlan, which translates to the land of white herons. Today, historians and archaeologists don't pinpoint Aztlan to a single easily identifiable spot on a modern map. Its exact location remains a subject of scholarly debate. However they trace the legendary homeland, the cultural hearth from which these stories likely sprang back to the central Mexican states we know today as Guanajuato, Jalisco, and Michoacan. It's within this broad region that a people speaking the Nahuatl language, who would later become known as the Aztecs, specifically the Mexica tribe, are believed to have originated. Their exodus from this ancestral land was more than just a practical relocation. It was, according to their mythology, a celestial command. The stories speak of a place called Chicamozdoc, the Seven Caves. From these 7 caves emerged 7 distinct tribes, all sharing a common linguistic and cultural background, the Nahua peoples. But the departure wasn't a single unified event. The legend suggests that not all groups left Chicamozdoc at the same time. In fact, it was apparently some 300 years after the first tribes emerged that the last tribe began their momentous journey. This final group, the one whose destiny would intertwine with the land that is now Mexico City, was the Mexica. It is their story, this epic migration filled with hardship and divine guidance, that we will follow today. The period in which the Mexican migration began, roughly between the 10th and 12th centuries AD, wasn't unique. It was a time of significant movement across Mesoamerica. Many similar migrations were taking place, driven by a complex interplay of environmental pressures, perhaps droughts or shifts in climate, and societal changes, including warfare or the collapse of earlier cultures. These weren't short trips. For several decades, perhaps even a couple of centuries, these semi-nomadic groups, including the Mexica, wandered across the vast and varied landscapes of what is now Mexico. As they travelled, the Mexica held on to their identity and history through a rich tradition of oral storytelling. Genealogies, mythologies, accounts of trials and divine instructions were passed down from generation to generation, keeping their purpose and struggles alive. Central to their narrative was the guidance of their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, his name meaning hummingbird left or hummingbird of the south, identifies him with the sun and warfare. Huitzilopochtli was said to favour the Mexica above all other tribes, speaking to their priests and leaders, charting their course and offering protection and instruction through visions and omens. Their migration wasn't a relentless march. The Mexica, despite their nomadic status, would periodically pause their journey. They would rest for significant periods, sometimes 10 or even 20 years at a time. During these pauses, they would establish small settlements, build temporary temples to Huitzilopochtli, and attempt to cultivate the land. But eventually the divine command would come again, the sign would appear, and they would pack up their belongings and move on, leaving behind the nascent towns they had built. These travels were far from easy. The oral histories are replete with accounts of immense challenges. They faced starvation as food sources dwindled or crops failed. Internal dissent and rebellion threatened to splinter the tribe. They engaged in warfare, defending themselves against hostile settled peoples or competing with other migrating groups. Their legends even speak of magical curses laid upon them by sorcerers and celestial destruction, perhaps comets or eclipses, interpreted as divine displeasure or trials. Yet through it all, a dogged perseverance defined the Mexica. They were a people on a mission driven by their faith in Huitzilopochtli and the promise of a destined homeland. This resilience, forged in the crucible of their long and arduous journey, would become a defining characteristic of the people who would one day build an empire. As they continued their slow, deliberate trek south, they were unknowingly heading towards the rich, complex, and already heavily populated region that would become the stage for their most dramatic struggles and their ultimate triumph, the Valley of Mexico. After decades, perhaps centuries of wandering, the many migrating Nahua groups began to filter into the Valley of Mexico. This fertile basin, nestled high in the central highlands, was a patchwork of lakes, marshlands, and fertile plains, and it had long been home to established city-states and cultures. The Mexica, our tribe, were among the last to arrive, finally reaching the valley floor around the year 1285. By the late 13th century, the Valley of Mexico was anything but empty. Most of the desirable land, the fertile plains, the defensible hillsides, the lake shores with easy access to resources, was already claimed by one people or another. The Mexican newcomers, with no territory of their own, found themselves in a difficult position. They attempted to occupy unclaimed or marginal territories, but they were continuously forced to move on, pushed out by the more established and powerful groups who viewed them as unwelcome intruders. Their struggle for a foothold in the valley was intense. Imagine being constantly on the move, unable to plant crops or build permanent homes, always looking over your shoulder, facing potential conflict with your neighbours. Despite these challenges, the Mexica managed to find a temporary respite. They were able to settle and fortify a strategically important location, Chapultepec, which means the Hill of Grasshoppers. This prominent hill offering a strong defensive position and access to freshwater springs must have felt like a haven after their long journey. However, their presence at Chapultepec quickly led to increased tensions with the surrounding established communities. The Mexica, hardened by their migration and fiercely devoted to their demanding god Huitzilopochtli, likely developed a reputation for being aggressive and unpredictable. In response to the rising hostility from their neighbours, the Mexica made a crucial decision. They elected a warrior as their leader. This marked a significant evolution for the tribe, signalling their readiness to shift from simply surviving to actively defending themselves and their interests, embracing a more militarily aggressive posture. According to the Spanish chronicler Diego Duran, a key source for much of our knowledge about the early Aztecs, the situation escalated rapidly. Within just 15 years of settling at Chapultepec, a major conflict erupted. Duran describes it vividly. A conspiracy was formed amongst the cities and neighbouring towns so that all together they would surround the Aztecs and annihilate them, not leaving one person alive. This coordinated attack highlights the level of fear and hostility the Mexica generated among their neighbours. They were truly facing existential annihilation. Yet according to their legends, divine intervention saved them. Huitzilopochtli reportedly warned the Mexica of the impending attack. Despite being outnumbered, the Mexica, perhaps using the defensive advantage of Chapultepec, were able to ambush the enemy army and critically capture the ringleader, a figure named Copil. Legend says that at the behest of Huitzilopochtli, Copil's heart was cut out, a ritual offering to the war god, and thrown into Lake Texcoco. This gruesome act was imbued with prophetic significance. It was said that the future site of the Mexica capital Tenochtitlan, later to become Mexico City, would rise from the spot where Copil's heart landed. While the heart of Copil carried prophetic weight, the fate of the other captured warriors was far more immediate and brutal. They were also ritualistically sacrificed. Unsurprisingly, this act did nothing to temper the hostilities with their neighbours. In fact, it likely solidified the image of the Mexica as dangerous and ruthless. Bitter fighting continued with relentless intensity. The situation became so dire, the legends claim that even Mexican women and children were forced to bear arms and join the defence. Eventually, despite fighting bravely, their outnumbered tribe was forced to abandon the area around Chapultepec. The combined forces of their enemies proved too much. They were once again refugees driven from a place they had hoped to make their home. Luckily, they found a temporary sanctuary. The Lord of Culiacan, whose domain lay to the south, allowed these desperate refugees to settle in his territories. However, this was not a generous gift of prime real estate. The land they were given, Tizapan, was a wilderness known for being full of vipers and poisonous snakes. It was a harsh, undesirable place likely given to the Mexica in the hope that the environment itself would contain or perhaps even destroy them. But the Mexica, ever resourceful and resilient, took this challenge in stride. According to Diego Duran, they adapted remarkably. They became so accustomed to catching and eating these dangerous creatures that over time it became rare to even see a viper in Tizapan. This incredible adaptability speaks volumes about their determination to survive against all odds. Over time, through their efforts and adaptation, the land of Tizapan became more habitable. The Mexica began to take up agriculture, cultivating crops to supplement their hunting and gathering. They engaged in trade with their neighbours, establishing economic connections. And crucial for their long-term integration and recovery, they began to intermingle with the people of Culiacan and other nearby groups through marriage and alliances. This period of relative tranquility and stability allowed the Mexica tribe to recover its strength, replenish its numbers, and learn valuable lessons about settled life, agriculture, and diplomacy. They were laying down roots, albeit shallow ones, in a land that wasn't yet their promised home. But this period of peace wouldn't last forever. Their destiny, as dictated by their fierce god, was still calling. For several decades, the Mexica thrived in Tizapan. They had survived persecution, overcome a hostile environment, and rebuilt their community. They were learning the ways of settled life, forming alliances, and recovering their strength. But their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, the war god, was not interested in peaceful agrarian life. His impatience with this period of tranquility grew. According to the legends, he proclaimed that it was time for the Mexica to abandon this comfortable existence, take up arms again, and pursue their true, divinely ordained destiny. To achieve this, a plan was devised by Huitzilopochtli's faithful servants, the Mexica priests. It was a plan that would shock their benefactors and irrevocably sever the ties they had built. An emissary was sent to the Lord of Culiacan, the ruler who had granted them refuge in Tizapan. The request was audacious. Seemingly designed to provoke, they asked for the hand of his young daughter, not just as a bride for a Mexican noble, but as the new queen of the Mexica people, and more shockingly, as a bride for Huitzilopochtli himself. The Lord of Culiacan, perhaps seeing this as a way to solidify his alliance with the increasingly strong Mexica, or perhaps flattered by the divine connection, granted the request. He allowed his daughter to go with the Mexica emissaries. They brought her back to their settlement in Tizapan, preparing for a grand ceremony. Then they summoned her father, the Lord of Culiacan, to a great feast, ostensibly to celebrate the marriage and the new alliance. During the celebrations, the Lord of Culiacan was invited to lay offerings inside the temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli. This was a gesture of respect and inclusion. As he approached the inner sanctuary holding the light of burning incense, he unveiled a sight of unspeakable horror. There before the altar of the war god stood a Mexica priest, and the priest was wearing the flayed skin of his own daughter. The young princess had been ritualistically killed as a sacrificial offering to Huitzilopochtli. This wasn't just a sacrifice, it was a calculated, brutal act designed to fulfill the god's demand for warfare. By sacrificing the daughter of their host and ally, the Mexica were deliberately burning their bridges. They were declaring their independence in the most violent and provocative way imaginable. Huitzilopochtli, they believed, now had his war. Seeing this unspeakable act, the Lord of Culiacan flew into a blinding rage. His grief and fury were absolute. He vowed to utterly destroy these wicked, treacherous subjects who had repaid his kindness with such a monstrous deed. He immediately summoned his armies for an attack, determined to wipe the Mexica from the face of the earth. The fighting was fierce and brutal. The Mexica, though perhaps outnumbered, fought with the desperation of those who had nowhere left to run. But the forces of Culiacan were fueled by a righteous curm. Ultimately, the Mexica warriors and their families were overwhelmed and driven back. With no retreat possible on land, their only escape lay in the waters of Lake Texcoco. In a moment of quick thinking born of desperation, they constructed makeshift rafts, likely from reeds or whatever buoyant materials they could find. They used these to escape into the lake, paddling frantically away from the vengeful armies of Culiacan. They hid themselves amongst the thick reeds on the far side of the waters, huddled together, exhausted, defeated, and facing the prospect of starting over yet again. It was here, amidst this scene of profound suffering, desperation, and uncertainty, that the Mexica reached their lowest point. But it was also here, in this moment of utter desolation, that their god Huitzilopochtli finally spoke to them with the promise of salvation. He announced that they were ready to go to the promised land, the place he had intended for them all along. The very next night, Huitzilopochtli appeared in the dreams of one of the Mexica priests. His message was clear and specific. He told the priest that upon the site where the heart of Copil had been thrown into the lake so many years ago, a great prickly pear cactus had sprung up, growing defiantly from the rock beneath the water. and upon this cactus they would find a magnificent eagle perched high devouring a serpent. This was the sign the long-awaited prophecy fulfilled. This site marked by the eagle, the cactus, and the serpent was the place Huitzilopochtli, now named Tenochtitlan. It would be here, in the most improbable of locations, a small marshy island in the middle of a lake deemed undesirable by everyone else, that the main group of the remaining Mexica would finally plant their roots, end their long wandering, and begin the next monumental stage of their journey, the building of their capital and the rise to empire. In the year 1325, guided by the divine vision of the eagle on the cactus, the Mexica people arrived at the prophesied spot in Lake Texcoco. What they found was far from an ideal location. Tenochtitlan was situated on a series of small marshy islands on the western edges of the vast lake system that dominated the Valley of Mexico. While the surrounding region of the valley was controlled by numerous powerful city-states, this particular area, the islands themselves, lay largely unclaimed. And for good reason. The land was swampy, unstable, and seemed to offer meagre prospects for agriculture. Furthermore, there was a distinct lack of readily available building materials like stone or timber on the islands themselves. It was by all conventional standards a highly undesirable place to build a city. Yet undaunted by these immense hurdles, the Mexica once again proved their extraordinary resourcefulness and determination. This was the place Huitzilopochtli had promised them, and they would make it work. If they couldn't immediately establish extensive farms on the unstable ground, they made do with the abundant resources the lake provided. They became expert hunters and gatherers, utilizing the lake's rich flora and fauna, fish, birds, insects, and various aquatic plants to sustain themselves in these early challenging years. Survival was key, but the vision was greater. The inhabitants of early Tenochtitlan, driven by necessity and ingenuity, began the monumental task of transforming their watery environment. They started by strategically draining some areas of marshland and filling in others with mud reeds and eventually stone and earth transported by boat. This painstaking process gradually expanded their islands, creating more stable and usable land. Slowly, methodically, they developed a form of agriculture uniquely suited to the lake environment. They didn't build traditional fields on dry land. Instead, they perfected an ingenious system known as chinampas. These were artificial islands created in the shallow parts of the lake. Layers of mud and vegetation were piled up within rectangular frames of reed skins and stakes anchored by willow trees planted at the corners. These floating gardens were incredibly fertile, constantly irrigated by the surrounding lake water, and could produce multiple harvests per year. This agricultural innovation, coupled with active trading across the lake using canoes, which allowed them to access resources and materials unavailable on their islands, enabled the Mexica settlement to not just survive, but to begin to expand. The once meagre prospects of the islands were being overcome by sheer human effort and clever engineering. Now on firmer footing, their population growing, the Mexica tribe recognized the need for more formalized leadership, not just a temporary warrior elected in crisis. They sought a Tlatoani, which means speaker, a hereditary ruler who could provide stability, administer justice led in war, and represent the community. A council of wise men, priests, and nobles was tasked with finding a suitable candidate, one of proper stature and lineage, someone who could legitimize their growing community in the eyes of the established powers in the valley and their own people. They eventually settled on a man named Acamapichtli. His choice was significant. While his father's side was of Mexican noble lineage, his mother was a princess from the prestigious city of Culhuacan. And crucially, the ruling dynasty of Culhuacan could trace its ancestry directly back to the revered Toltecs, an earlier highly influential civilization in the region, whose legacy was still deeply respected throughout the Valley of Mexico. By choosing a ruler with Toltec blood, the Mexica were strategically linking themselves to a glorious past, enhancing their own legitimacy and prestige. In 1375, Acamapichtli, along with his recently married bride, was brought back to Tenochtitlan for a grand coronation. He was crowned the first Tlatoani of the Mexica. This was a pivotal moment, marking the transition from a wandering tribe with ad hoc leadership to a more formal city-state with recognized ruler and a clear line of authority. Tenochtitlan had a king. However, this growing organization and strength, even on their marginal islands, began to draw unwanted attention. The Valley of Mexico was a fiercely competitive place. Powerful neighbors watched the upstart community on the lake with wary eyes. Chief among these was the expanding city-state of Azcapotzalco, located on the western shore of the lake, which had been founded by the Tepanecs, another one of the original migrating Nahua tribes who had arrived in the valley much earlier. The still relatively weak Mexica and their nascent city of Tenochtitlan were in no position to resist the might of Azcapotzalco. They were thus forced to become vassals to the Tepanec kingdom. As vassals, they were subjected to heavy tribute payments for the privilege of occupying their islands and conducting business on the lake. This was a humbling position for a tribe that had believed themselves guided by a destiny of greatness. But even under this oppressive yoke, paying taxes and subject to the will of another ruler, the Mexica and Tenochtitlan continued to grow stronger, day by day, learning, building, and waiting for their moment. For decades, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan lived under the shadow of Azcapotzalco. They were subjects, not masters, required to pay heavy tribute in goods, labor, and military service to their Tepanec overlords. Yet paradoxically, this period of vassalage was also a crucial time of growth and development for the burgeoning city on the lake. Under the rule of their first Tlatoani, Acamapichtli, who reigned for about 2 decades until his death around 1396, Tenochtitlan transformed from a small settlement into a proper city. Despite the limitations imposed by Azcapotzalco, significant infrastructure was built. Residential areas expanded beyond the original islands, connected by bridges and causeways. Temples dedicated to their gods, including Huitzilopochtli, began to rise, asserting their religious identity. Parks and public spaces were created. A network of canals provided transportation throughout the city, like the streets of a mainland town, allowing canoes to move goods and people. It was a time of relative peace enforced by the Tepanec dominance. This stability, though achieved under the rule of others, allowed the Mexica to consolidate their gains, perfect their Chinampa agriculture, and grow their population and economy. By the time of Acamapichtli's death, at the age of approximately 70, Tenochtitlan was a far cry from the desperate refugee camp it had once been. In a testament to his effective leadership and the growing strength of the nobility, Acamapichtli specifically requested that the people be allowed to choose his successor from amongst his 7 sons, a break from strict hereditary succession that indicated a degree of established political process. In 1396, the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan elected Prince Huitzilihuitl as their new Tlatoani. His reign marked a significant shift in the relationship with Azcapotzalco. The young monarch was strategically wedded to a princess of Azcapotzalco, a daughter of the Tepanec king Tezozomoc. This important political marriage fostered a closer tie between the two cities, and perhaps more importantly led to a lessening of the harsh policies and tribute demands previously levied on the vassal city of Tenochtitlan. Over time, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan were granted more and more favours by their Tepanec overlords. Their status improved, their burdens lightened. Crucially, the Mexica were increasingly called upon to participate in the military campaigns of their overlords, the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco. The Mexica warriors, forged in the hardships of their migration and known for their ferocity and devotion to Huitzilopochtli, proved to be excellent fighters. They often served as powerful shock troops thrown into the most difficult battles. Together, Tenochtitlan and Azcapotzalco subjugated many of the city-states and peoples in the surrounding area. The campaigns began in their immediate vicinity, expanding Tepenec dominance throughout the Valley of Mexico, and then ventured further and further afield. Along the way, the Mexica warriors earned prestige and rewards. They were granted important tracts of land often conquered from others which were of significant agricultural value compared to their limited Chinampa Islands. This allowed the nobility to acquire wealth and resources, further strengthening Tenochtitlan's position within the Tepenec sphere. Eventually, the blood spilled in shared battles and the bonds shared through marriage earned the city of Tenochtitlan a place as one of the favoured vassals under the Azcapotzalco Tepenecs. By around 1410, the Tepenecs controlled a large portion of the Mexico Valley, and their Mexica vassals were a significant factor in their military success and growing power. It seemed the Mexica had found their place within the existing power structure, rising through service and alliance. However, this alliance, beneficial as it had become, was not destined to last. The ambition and growing strength of Tenochtitlan would inevitably clash with the established authority of its overlords. The delicate balance of power between Azcapotzalco and its favoured vassal Tenochtitlan began to fray. When King Huitzilopochtli of Tenochtitlan died in 1417, he left behind a young prince, Chimalpopoca, as heir to the throne. Chimalpopoca was a grandson of the powerful old Tepenec king of Azcapotzalco Tezozomoc through his mother Huitzilihuitl's queen. Too young to rule effectively on his own, Chimalpopoca was guided by his royal council composed of the leading Mexican nobles and priests. These men, ambitious for their city and increasingly tired of being vassals, saw an opportunity in the young king's direct connection to the Tepenec throne. They attempted to exploit the strong relationship Chimalpopoca maintained with his maternal grandfather, King Tezozomoc. The Mexica Council constantly whispered in their young king's ear, pushing him to ask for special favours from his grandfather, particularly reductions in the tribute they still owed and greater autonomy. While the old king of Azcapotzalco often warmed to such requests, influenced by his affection for his grandson, his own council and powerful nobles did not. They were increasingly wary of the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, who grew bolder and more assertive with each passing year. Every new attempt by Tenochtitlan to throw off the obligations of vassalage to assert its independence made the city on the lake look less and less like a necessary ally and more like a potential challenger to Tepenec dominance. The tension was building, a slow burn simmering beneath the surface of the alliance. The straw that broke the camel's back appears to have been a fundamental conflict over resources, specifically a vital one, clean water. Tenochtitlan, built on brackish marshes in the lake, had long lacked a reliable source of fresh drinking water. They had previously been granted limited access to the springs of Chapultepec, ironically the very place they'd been driven from years before. Now, with their population growing and their ambitions rising, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan requested something far more significant from their overlords. They asked Azcapotzalco to provide them with the men and materials necessary to build an aqueduct, a massive stone and earth channel, stretching several miles across the lake to bring fresh water directly from the Chapultepec springs into the heart of Tenochtitlan. This was not a request for help. It was the sort of demand that a powerful lord might make to his subject. It was a clear signal of Tenochtitlan's growing sense of entitlement and independence. To the powers in Azcapotzalco, particularly the Tepenec Council, who already distrusted the Mexica, this request was outrageous. It infuriated them. They saw it as an unacceptable overreach by their vassals. The Tepenec Council now openly called for the elimination of the Mexica. They argued that Tenochtitlan had become too dangerous, too ambitious, and must be destroyed before it could threaten Azcapotzalco itself. The old king Tezozomoc, caught between his council's fears and his affection for his grandson Chimalpopoca, pleaded to have the young Mexica king spared, but his pleas were refused. Legend says that the anguish of this conflict, the realization of the inevitable clash he could not prevent, was so great that King Tezozomoc died of grief. In his place, a new ruler rose to the throne of Azcapotzalco, a man named Maxtla, known for his harsh adversarial nature. Maxtla had no love for the Mexica or his nephew Chimalpopoca. He immediately reversed his father's softer policies. Not only did he deny the Mexica's request for supplies to build their aqueduct, but he also revoked their existing access to the Chapultepec water springs altogether. He was effectively cutting off their vital water supply, a declaration of hostile intent. But Maxtla's aggression didn't stop there. He saw Chimalpopoca as a potential rallying point for Mexica resistance. Assassins were dispatched to Tenochtitlan. These agents managed to infiltrate the royal palace and carry out their deadly mission, killing King Chimalpopoca, and according to some accounts, his heir as well. The news of their king's assassination threw the Mexica of Tenochtitlan into a panic. They were leaderless, their water supply was cut off, and their powerful overlord in Azcapotzalco was openly hostile and actively seeking their destruction. It was a moment of profound crisis, perhaps even darker than being driven from Chapultepec or Tizapan. They were cornered, desperate, and facing total annihilation. But the Mexica had faced existential threats before. In 1428 they turned once more to the leadership of a strong warrior king, a leader capable of guiding them through the fire and forging defiance from despair. Their long, arduous journey had led them to the brink, but it was also preparing them for their greatest fight yet. With their young king assassinated and their city under threat, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan needed a leader who could inspire them to fight for survival. They found that leader in the person of Itzcoatl. He was a seasoned warrior, a son of the first Tlatoani Acamapichtli, though not by the Culhuacan princess, which gave him a strong lineage tied directly to the city's founding. Upon his coronation in 1428, Itzcoatl acted swiftly and decisively. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Itzcoatl made one last desperate attempt to reach a peaceful resolution with Maxtla and Azcapotzalco. But diplomacy failed. Maxtla was determined to crush Tenochtitlan. With no other option left, the people of Tenochtitlan were roused for battle. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about liberation from a brutal oppressor. The Mexican knew they could not defeat Azcapotzalco alone. The Tepanec kingdom was too powerful, too entrenched. In preparation for the upcoming showdown, Itzcoatl and his council sought allies. The political atmosphere in the Valley of Mexico was ripe for such messages. Maxtla's harsh rule hadn't just targeted Tenochtitlan. Many other city-states throughout the valley had also chafed under the heavy hand of Azcapotzalco's dominance and felt threatened by Maxtla's aggression. The first to rise up and cast their lot with the rebellious Mexica were the Acolhua of Texcoco, a major city on the eastern side of Lake Texcoco, led by their eloquent and capable ruler Nezahualcoyotl. Texcoco had its own grievances with Azcapotzalco and saw an opportunity to reclaim its former prestige. Together, the forces of Tenochtitlan and Texcoco launched their rebellion against Azcapotzalco. They fought fiercely, fueled by years of resentment and the immediate threat of annihilation. They achieved some key early successes, proving that the Tepanecs were not invincible. These initial victories sent shockwaves through the valley. They convinced another important Tepanec city, Tlacopan or Tacuba, located just west of Tenochtitlan, to abandon its allegiance to Azcapotzalco and cast in their lot with the uprising. With the defection of Tlacopan, the alliance was complete. This was the birth of the Triple Alliance, an unprecedented coalition formed by Tenochtitlan, Texcoco and Tlacopan, united against their common oppressor Azcapotzalco. This Triple Alliance now launched itself with full force at their former masters in Azcapotzalco. It was a desperate war for liberation, a fight for the very future of their cities and peoples. The Allied armies fought with fanatical determination. They were said to have quickly pushed the enemy back on the defensive, driving the Tepanec forces back towards their capital. The climax of the war was the siege of Azcapotzalco itself. Legend holds that the Allied forces attacked the Tepanec capital relentlessly for 114 days, over 3 months, before finally breaching its defences. When the walls were finally breached, the fury of the attackers was unleashed. The city was sacked, its temples were looted, its buildings burned, and its population, including the Tepanec nobility, were butchered. The destruction was total and absolute. When it was all over, not much was left of the once proud and powerful kingdom of Azcapotzalco. Its dominance in the Valley of Mexico was utterly shattered. In its place would rise a far more formidable coalition, the Triple Alliance, which would become known to history as the famous Aztec Empire. The victory was complete. The Mexica, along with their allies Texcoco and Tlacopan, were no longer vassals. They were the new masters of the valley. Following the defeat of Azcapotzalco around 1428, the 3 victorious cities divided the spoils and the responsibilities. Tlacopan, being the smallest partner in the alliance, assumed control of the western side of the Mexico Valley, receiving 1/5 of the total tribute collected from the conquered areas. Texcoco took control of the eastern side, also receiving 2/5 of the tribute. And Tenochtitlan, under the leadership of its Coatl, claimed control of the northern and southern parts of the valley, including the most fertile lands, and received the largest share, the remaining 2/5 of the tribute. The power dynamic within the alliance was already tilting towards Tenochtitlan. The first task of this new alliance was to secure its position and consolidate its power within the Valley of Mexico. This was done through aggressive military action. Campaigns to the south were particularly important. Through these conquests, the alliance gained control of the region's breadbasket, the highly productive Chinampa districts located in the freshwater lakes of Xochimilco and Chalco. These areas were even more fertile and extensive than Tenochtitlan's own Chinampas, and provided a vital source of food for the growing populations of the allied cities. To the victors came unprecedented amounts of new land, a steady flow of tribute from conquered peoples, and expanded trade networks. This initial consolidation phase solidified the Triple Alliance's control over the valley and provided the resources necessary for future expansion. Further expansion would largely be motivated by these same economic interests: the acquisition of more land, more tribute, and the control of lucrative trade routes. As Michael Smith states in his book on the Aztecs, the growing numbers of commoners in Tenochtitlan and other imperial capitals required ever-increasing amounts of food, cloth, and other necessities, while the nobles required exotic luxury goods to maintain their lifestyles and social positions. The economic strategy therefore involved the conquest of rich areas and the establishment of a program of regular tribute payments, as well as the encouragement of trade and markets throughout the empire. At this critical juncture, it's vital to understand the nature of the emerging Aztec Empire. It was what historians call a hegemonic empire rather than a territorial one like the Roman Empire, where conquered lands were directly annexed, governed by appointed officials, and often culturally assimilated. The Aztec approach was different. When the Triple Alliance conquered a city-state, it didn't typically overthrow the local government and install Aztec rulers. Instead, the local ruling elite were often kept in place provided they pledged loyalty to the Triple Alliance, paid tribute, and supplied troops when required. Under this system, conquered cities were forced to provide a mix of obligations. Soldiers would be called upon in the event of a major military campaign swelling the ranks of the Triple Alliance armies. Tribute would be supplied regularly, often on a semi-annual basis. These shipments weren't just symbolic. They were the economic lifeblood of the empire, including vast quantities of food like maize, beans, and chia, as well as valuable goods like gold, silver, jade, textiles, feathers, weapons, armor, and other valuables specific to the region's resources. In return for this tribute and military service, the conquered cities were granted relative autonomy in their internal affairs. They kept their own rulers, laws, and customs as long as they didn't rebel. They were also afforded protection by the might of the Triple Alliance. Protection both from external enemies and often from internal dissent enforced by the threat of Aztec military intervention. Furthermore, they gained access to the vast economic network that developed under the umbrella of Aztec rule, benefiting from the stability and trade routes the empire maintained. It's important to mention that other factors also helped bind the subjects of the empire to their new masters, fostering a degree of integration and loyalty, or at least compliance. These included strategic intermarriage between Aztec nobility and the ruling families of conquered cities, gift-giving rituals, the imposition or encouragement of certain religious ceremonies focused on the Aztec pantheon, especially Huitzilopochtli, and grand construction projects in subject territories that demonstrated the empire's power and resources. But perhaps most importantly, underlying this complex system of alliances, tribute, and cultural influence was the ever-present threat of violence. This last point is key to truly understanding how the Aztec Empire maintained control, and it bears repeating. As Ross Hassig states in his book on Aztec warfare, the Aztecs maintained the empire with great economy of force by relying on local resources for local security and order. The Aztec army did not have to maintain a presence, but was mobilized only for further conquests or to deal with rebellions and other major disruptions. For lesser matters, the threat of this army's return was sufficient to ensure compliance by the subordinates. This combination of economic benefit, limited autonomy, cultural ties, and overwhelming military power held the hegemonic empire together. It was a system that allowed the Triple Alliance to expand rapidly without needing to establish a massive centralized bureaucracy or garrison troops throughout its vast territories. It was efficient, profitable, and terrifyingly effective. Now that we have established the nature of the Aztec Empire forged by the Triple Alliance, we can provide an overview of the following centuries, taking a closer look at the accomplishments of its principal rulers, primarily those of Tenochtitlan, as it steadily became the dominant power within the alliance. We left off with the founding of the Triple Alliance in 1428 under the leadership of Itzcoatl, the warrior king of Tenochtitlan. Itzcoatl had been brought to power specifically to lead the Mexica in their war for liberation. Having achieved victory over Azcapotzalco and established the Triple Alliance, he continued his military leadership, launching further campaigns across the Valley of Mexico to bring the various remaining independent city-states under their collective control. Once conquest and consolidation within the valley were achieved, Itzcoatl oversaw the first expeditions sent out beyond the confines of the basin. These war parties ventured forth, expanding the reach of the Triple Alliance into new territories like the lands of Cuauhnahuac to the south, pushing the boundaries of the nascent empire. In 1440, after 14 years in power that saw the Mexica transition from struggling vassals to dominant partners in a major alliance, the great warrior king Itzcoatl died. His funeral ceremonies were elaborate, lasting 80 days, a period filled with great displays of wealth and power. These ceremonies were a powerful testament to just how far the Mexica of Tenochtitlan had come since the founding of their city a mere century earlier. They had gone from desperate refugees on a marshy island to the leading power in a rapidly expanding empire. The next king, Moctezuma, I often called Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, he who shoots the sky, who reigned from 1440 to 1469, would take the Triple Alliance, and particularly Tenochtitlan, even further. He first reaffirmed the alliance's dominance within the Mexico Valley through continued military action against any lingering resistance. He also oversaw political consolidation, strengthening the ties and administrative structure of the empire. Simultaneously, Moctezuma I initiated massive building projects in Tenochtitlan, most notably the expansion of the Templo Mayor, the great temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, and the rain god Tlaloc, which stood at the heart of the city. This monumental construction was a physical manifestation of Tenochtitlan's growing power and religious centrality. At the same time, Moctezuma I was a major reformer. New laws were passed to begin reshaping Aztec society. These formalized the distinctions between nobles, Pipiltin, and commoners, Masihualtin, creating a more rigid class structure. Privileges were granted to great warriors and priests, recognizing their importance to the state. A system of universal schooling was established, Tel Pochcalli for commoners focusing on military training and basic skills, and Calmacac for nobles focusing on religion, history, writing and statesmanship. Courts and judges were instituted to administer justice, and clear punishments were laid out for crimes such as theft and adultery. Moctezuma was not just a conqueror, he was a statesman who laid the legal and social foundation for the mature Aztec Empire. Externally, the Aztecs were also much more active under Moctezuma I. Military campaigns now spilled out aggressively across the region, expanding the empire's reach hundreds of miles from Tenochtitlan. Such was the strength of the Triple Alliance and its growing network of tributary states, that according to some accounts they were able to raise armies of up to 200,000 warriors to conquer distant cities like Quextlahueca in Oaxaca. By the end of his almost 30-year reign, Moctezuma had overseen a massive period of military conquest, infrastructure construction and societal expansion that left a legacy of riches, power and grandeur unmatched by any ruler before him. The Mexica rise to prominence was undeniable. His successor Axayacatl reigned, 1469 to 1481, consolidated the Aztec holdings, particularly along the Gulf Coast, a vital source of tropical goods and tribute. He continued the expansion to the north and south, facing various challenges and achieving several major military victories. These included the brutal suppression of a brief but significant civil war in the neighbouring city of Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's sister city on another island in the lake, which was decisively absorbed into Tenochtitlan. However, these conquests did not go uninterrupted, and Axayacatl's reign saw significant challenges to Aztec power. The Tlaxcala Confederacy, located to the east, remained obstinately independent and a constant thorn in the empire's side, resisting all attempts at conquest. Even more significantly, the powerful Tarascan people to the northwest, who possessed superior metalworking technology, bronze and copper weapons and armor-blunted Aztec expansion in that direction, with a crushing defeat in 1479 at the Battle of Zinapacuaro. This defeat by the Tarascans was one of the first major military setbacks the Triple Alliance had suffered since its founding, and it deeply marred the image of Axayacatl. He died just 2 years later in 1481, his reign ending on a note of both expansion and frustration. His younger brother Tizoc reigned 1481 to 1486, became the next Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Unfortunately for the empire, Tizoc proved to be a poor leader and a less than capable military commander. His coronation campaign, traditionally a demonstration of the new ruler's martial prowess through conquest, was essentially a defeat failing to capture significant territory. The following years of his reign saw very little new territory added to the empire. Within just a few years, Tizoc's ineffective rule alienated the powerful military nobility, who saw the empire's momentum stalling. His reign would be cut short by what appears to have been an assassination orchestrated by these frustrated elites. His death highlights the intensely political nature of the Aztec court and the high expectations placed upon the Tlatoani to be a successful military leader. The next ruler, Huitzotl, reigned 1486 to 1502. Also a brother of Axayacatl and Tizoc, immediately focused on repairing the image of the Aztecs and restoring their military prestige after the lackluster reign of his predecessor. His early military campaigns were used to crack the whip on areas that had stopped paying tribute during the weak rule of Tizoc, brutally reasserting imperial authority. Successful military actions were then launched into more rebellious regions and previously unconquered foreign territory, expanding the empire once more. Huitzotl was known for the ferocity of his campaigns. Slaughter and enslavement were common means of quickly re-establishing control and terrifying potential dissenters. These battles also yielded vast numbers of war captive who were brought back to the capital for grisly sacrifice. Huitzotl was a fervent devotee of Huitzilopochtli, and his reign is marked by a dramatic increase in the scale of human sacrifice. The dedication of the new massively expanded Templo Mayor in 1487 reportedly featured the slaughter of over 80,000 prisoners over the course of 4 days, a chilling demonstration of imperial power and religious fervour. The island capital of Tenochtitlan itself would see further celebrations and expansion under Huitzotl. He oversaw major renovation and infrastructure projects, including the construction of a new aqueduct from a different spring source to cope with the city's growing population. The city continued its transformation into a monumental imperial centre. Such was the power and influence that Huitzotl gained during this period through his successful conquests and control of immense resources and tribute that the rulers of Tenochtitlan effectively took over most of the duties of running the entire empire of the Triple Alliance. While Texcoco and Tlacopan remained allies and partners, their rulers' influence waned compared to the ever-increasing might of the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. From now on, the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan was increasingly known as Huey Tlatoani, or the Supreme King, or Great Speaker, acknowledging his paramount position. In 1502, Huitzotl died and was succeeded by his nephew Moctezuma II, often called Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma the Younger, who had previously distinguished himself as an experienced general and administrator. Moctezuma II continued the previous efforts of consolidation and conquest, often relying on the terror established by Huitzotl's brutal campaigns. The scale of the empire's military power under Moctezuma II was immense. Incredibly, accounts suggest one of his largest campaigns aimed at crushing the resource-rich region of eastern Oaxaca summoned an army of 400,000 warriors. A few years later, another army of 200,000 was reportedly raised to take the heavily fortified Mixtec city of Tututepec on the Pacific coast. By this time, even the formidable Tlaxcala Confederacy, the long-standing independent holdout, was beginning to feel the immense pressure as the massive territorial vice of the empire tightened around their lands. The Aztec Empire, dominated by Tenochtitlan, was reaching its peak, larger and more powerful than ever before, seemingly unstoppable in its expansion. Yet at this critical moment, when the Mexica had transformed from wandering refugees into the rulers of an empire spanning hundreds of miles and millions of people, the hand of fate intervened. The meteoric rise of the Aztecs, a culmination of centuries of struggle, sacrifice and conquest, was cut short by an event that would forever change the course of history. The arrival of the Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés in 1519. It is incredible to think that just over 230 years earlier, in 1285, the Mexica tribe themselves had been the newcomers in the Valley of Mexico, a small vulnerable group begging for a place to settle. Now in 1508, when Europeans first encountered them, they beheld not a tribe, but a vast, sophisticated empire. This empire covered an estimated 135,000 square kilometres, which is roughly 52 to 100 square miles an area, comparable in size to the state of North Carolina. It encompassed more than 400 subject city-states and towns holding a population potentially numbering in the millions. And at its beating heart was the gem of Tenochtitlan, the island capital founded on a prophecy and built on sheer will and ingenuity. By 1519, Tenochtitlan was a monumental city, one of the largest in the world at the time. It boasted a sprawling grid complex of magnificent palaces, towering temples, bustling markets, beautiful gardens and residential housing, all interwoven with a network of canals. Miles of raised causeways radiated out from the city, connecting the islands to the mainland, serving as vital arteries for travel and defence. Clean water flowed into the city through the impressive stone aqueducts they had finally built. The city bustled with activity. Some 200,000 inhabitants, nobles, priests, soldiers, merchants, skilled craftsmen, farmers and schoolchildren traversed the landscape on foot along the causeways and paths or by boat along the canals. This incredible sight astounded the first European visitors who had seen nothing like it. They dubbed it the Venice of the New World, a fitting comparison given its watery setting and intricate network of waterways, but one that perhaps still didn't fully capture its unique Mesoamerican grandeur. It is with this vision of Tenochtitlan at its peak a testament to the incredible journey and relentless spirit of the Mexica people that we will conclude this episode. We've traced their path from mythical origins and desperate wandering to becoming the masters of a vast empire and the builders of a magnificent capital. I hope that we've been able to demystify the long and complex rise of the Aztecs and lay the groundwork for further exploration of their amazing civilization. The story doesn't end here, of course. There will be far more to cover in the future when it comes to discussing the politics, religion, economy, warfare, and daily life of this powerful Mesoamerican empire, as well as, of course, the dramatic story of their encounter with the Spanish and the empire's eventual fall. And I couldn't be more excited to share those stories with you. A huge thanks is owed to our supporters on platforms like Patreon, whose generosity helps make videos like this possible. And of course, immense gratitude to the many talented researchers, writers, artists, and historical consultants whose work informed and inspired this production. If you found this topic interesting and want to learn more about our fascinating past, check out these related videos. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more history content. And check out the description below for ways to support our work and explore further resources. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.